back to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we will complete our discussion of the ethics of St. Thomas Aquinas. You'll recall that in our previous video, we discussed the Cardinal Virtues, and these were the virtues of classical antiquity. They were prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, and these are primarily the virtues that we need to succeed in human society, in human life, to attain a sort of human perfection. Now, as Aquinas discusses, there is a form of these virtues called the purifying virtues, or the virtues of a purified mind, which move us toward our final end, which is beatitude or union with God. But primarily in their basic form, the cardinal virtues are about a human life and succeeding and flourishing in a life in human society. But of course, because there is a more primary element to Aquinas' ethics, which is always oriented toward God, always oriented toward beatitude and union with God, there's also another set of virtues he calls the theological virtues, which he thinks can't be attained in the same way that the Aristotelian cardinal or pagan virtues can. They can't just be attained through our effort and our training and our pursuit. In fact, we need to have them as gifts from an outside source, and of course that source is God. So in this video, we're going to examine Aquinas' view of the theological virtues, how we attain them, and how they work together to inculcate our human perfection. So the first thing we should do is take a look at what these virtues are. So remember the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. The theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity. And sort of the source for these virtues, it comes from 1 Corinthians in the following well-known passage from Paul the Apostle. He says, "Now these three remain, faith, hope, and love." Also is a sort of cognate, or it means the same thing as charity in this context. So faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Now, if we take this passage from 1 Corinthians seriously, there's a few questions that we need to answer. First, what is faith? What is hope? What is love? Second, how do all these work together? And third, why is the greatest of these love? Why is that the most important? Okay, so to get into these questions, the first thing I want to remind us of is Aquinas' two different views of beatitude. So remember, beatitude is the ultimate good of man, and for that reason, our perfect beatitude only comes through a final union with God. However, Aquinas, just like Aristotle, thinks that there is some sense in which we can attain at least an imperfect beatitude in this life. So our perfect beatitude only comes through a union with God, which will come after death in heaven. But we can have an imperfect beatitude in this life, and we do that primarily, Aquinas says, through a life of contemplation, through a life of virtue, and there he's heavily drawing on Aristotle. So while this is to say that what I'm about to say is somewhat simplified, one way to think about this is that a life of imperfect beatitude can sort of be lived primarily through pursuing the cardinal virtues. But if we want to attain perfect beatitude, we need something else, because as Aquinas tells us when explaining perfect beatitude, the other sort is a beatitude which exceeds man's nature, and which a man can only attain by God's power, through a certain participation in the divine nature. So there's a sense in which our ultimate perfection cannot come through our own effort. Our ultimate perfection has to come from something outside of ourselves, and as he says, in our participation in the divine nature. And this is precisely where the theological virtues come in. So, whereas for imperfect beatitude, we might say acquired virtue is sufficient, right? Someone like Aquinas could admit that a non-Christian or a pagan like Aristotle could attain imperfect beatitude insofar as Aristotle was a highly virtuous person, engaged in the life of contemplation. As far as a human life is concerned, just within a human context and in human society, we might say someone like Aristotle is an exemplar for what Aquinas is talking about, in that he displays all the four cardinal virtues. And so for imperfect beatitude, we might say acquired virtue is sufficient, the kind of virtue you can earn and train yourself through habit to have. But if you want perfect beatitude, then we need what Aquinas calls infused virtue. virtue that you cannot get through your own effort, virtue that comes from outside of yourself as a gift, or as it is said, through the grace of God. Okay, so we have said, of course, that these three theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity. And we should say something to characterize a little bit about how these virtues are oriented and what their characteristics are. So he gives us three characteristics of these theological virtues. And the first one is, what is their object? He says the theological virtues have God as their object. So very similar to the purifying forms of the cardinal virtues, where we are moving away from worldly affairs, turning ourselves toward the divine. The object of the theological virtues is God alone. Their entire purpose is to orient us toward the divine, prepare us to unite with God, and ultimately enable us to participate or achieve perfect beatitude. So they're supposed to orient us toward God. As I've also suggested, the second major characteristic is that these are infused in us by God alone. We can only get them through the grace of God. And he further explains this. There are some habits by which a man is well disposed toward an end that exceeds the power of human nature. And this end is man's ultimate and perfect beatitude. So if you look at human nature by itself, it simply is not up to the task in and of itself of ultimate human perfection. To that extent, there's a sense in which a human life can be tragic. It's tragic in the sense that no matter what we do through our own effort, we will never be able to attain our ultimate fulfillment. But as I mentioned previously, that sort of tragic aspect comes with a set of good news, and of course that promising or positive aspect is that our perfect beatitude is possible for us through the infused virtue, the infused habits that only come from God. And so Aquinas says, he continues on, since habits have to be proportioned to that toward which a man is disposed by them, it follows there have to be habits that dispose him toward an end of the sort that exceeds the power of human nature. So like I said last time, Aquinas looks at the human being and he sees a being that is constantly striving and willing and pursuing ultimate satisfaction. But also he looks at human nature and says, human nature simply is not up to the task. As biological and human organisms, as a human animal, we are destined to forever will, to ever strive, to always be dissatisfied. So in order to avoid that sort of tragic outcome where what we want most is what we can never have, Aquinas says it must be the case that there are some habits we can develop or that can be inculcated us from outside. And as he says, such habits can never exist in a man except by divine infusion. So faith, hope, and charity are perhaps things we can participate in, but they're primarily gifts from God. And the third aspect, he says, these theological virtues are made known to us only through divine revelation in sacred scripture. And so this is again why for him, in a certain sense, the more broadly theistic and more specific Christian worldview is necessary to achieve ultimate perfection, because he thinks we can only know about faith, hope, and charity through sacred scripture as found in the Bible. So now that we have seen a little bit about what characterizes the theological virtues, we should say something about what exactly they do. Previously, we said that all virtue for Aquinas is a perfection of our power. So if that's true, then just as the cardinal virtues perfected us in some way, so the theological virtues should do so in some way as well. And what Aquinas tells us is that the theological virtues perfect us regarding our reason or intellect, and also through our will. So there's these two respects in which the theological virtues enable us to achieve perfect beatitude by perfecting our reason and perfecting our will. Now this is similar, of course, to what we saw with the cardinal virtues. We saw one of the cardinal virtues, prudence, is supposed to perfect our reason as considered in itself. It's supposed to make you think properly, have a good reasoning process, have a sort of practical wisdom about what should be done, a sense of what is most important. And also the other virtues, the other cardinal virtues also have an influence on our will. So justice makes us follow reason when we're thinking about acting in a way that's unjust. And then temperance and fortitude control our passions. They inculcate a sense of self-control. So when we don't want to do something that's scary or painful, or we want to give into immediate pleasure, we can't control ourselves. So in a very similar way, the theological virtues are also perfecting our reason and they are perfecting our will. But of course, the cardinal virtues only do that in a human context. The theological virtues have to do it in a higher, more divine sense. And here I think it's important to see that Aquinas relies on this, another famous Bible passage from 1 Corinthians, which says, "Eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man what God has prepared for those who love him." So we might say, well, if you think about the person who follows the cardinal virtues, the person who's self-controlled, who's wise, who thinks correctly, who acts justly, we can sort of conceptualize from our human point of view what that person is like. We can imagine them. Maybe we've even met some people who approximate that ideal to some respect. Maybe you approximate that ideal to some respect. So even if we admit we're not perfectly virtuous, if we admit we don't have all the cardinal virtues to a perfect degree, we can certainly agree that, we can conceptualize what that looks like. But what Aquinas says is the theological virtues are orienting us and perfecting us toward an end that we cannot conceptualize. Our ultimate end of beatitude, of union with God, is something we can maybe talk about and maybe consider in a hypothetical way, but we can't truly imagine what that would be like to experience. And so the theological virtues are orienting us toward something that our human point of view cannot conceptualize or understand. That's why he cites the passage that the eye has not seen, nor the ear heard, nor has it entered into our heart what God has prepared for us. So we can see the cardinal and theological virtues doing similar things, perfecting us, and in that way they're similar. But the theological virtues are pushing us towards something that is beyond our human experience, and this is a reason why they need to be added to man supernaturally through God. So if that's the case, the next question then is, well, how do these virtues actually do that? How do the theological virtues perfect our reason? How do they perfect our will? And we can break it down in this way. So first, the perfection of our reason comes through faith. So whatever faith is, which we'll discuss shortly, makes our reason perfect. Then let's consider the perfection of the will. There's two aspects of this, right? A perfect will intend the end of perfect beatitude. What that means is you would desire perfect beatitude, you would see it as the most important thing, you would pursue it. And the virtue which allows us to do that, which perfects our will in this sense, is hope. And then finally, the other way in which theological virtues is actually allowing us to unite with God, or the end of perfect beatitude. So you might think of it this way, right? You might intend to do something good, but you might just lack the means to do it. You might say, I wish I could do that, right? I desire to do that, I'm motivated to do that, but I just don't have the means to do it. Like you could say, for instance, well, I would really like to give to charity, I would like to help others, but I simply don't have the money to do so. So this is the analogy here. Hope is what gives you the desire for God. It gives you the intention to work toward God. But what actually allows you to complete that action, to complete your union with God and the divine being, that's charity or love. So to sum up, faith perfects our reason, hope and charity perfect the will. And we should say a few things about each of these. So Aquinas cites another well-known Bible passage that talks about faith, and it's really important to understand what he means by faith and what he doesn't mean by faith. So he cites this passage which says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Okay, so what does Aquinas mean by faith here? Well, one thing he doesn't mean is just sort of a blind stab into the dark, believing something willy-nilly, believing something without any reason. Right? In fact, if you look at the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, one of his major topics, one of his major preoccupations was this relationship between faith and reason. Right? Between believing things on the basis of evidence and logic and argument, which would be reason, and believing perhaps without those things, or taking a sort of leap of faith of believing without sort of a knockdown argument that something is true. And Aquinas thought both of these things were relevant and necessary. And the way he saw it was that faith is simply the completion of reason. Reason, our intellect, can take us so far, and to get us to and this is a human virtue, to reason well, just as prudence was a cardinal virtue that perfected our intellect and our reason. So it is a virtue to reason well and be logical. But our reason and logic can only take us so far. Faith is a gift of God that perfects our reason beyond what we are capable of. So Aquinas tells us faith is a habit of the mind by which the eternal life has its beginnings in us, and which makes the intellectual assent to things that are not apparent. So faith doesn't mean you're going to believe in something you know is false, that you know is impossible. It just means you're believing in something that isn't evidently or apparently true, or perhaps which you don't have sufficient or complete evidence for. Now, the other thing to say is, well, okay, why does this matter? Why is faith important? Well, what are we primarily talking about with faith? Well, given that beatitude, or perfect beatitude, is union with God, the first most important thing would be to have a belief in God. And faith is what allows you to have a full belief in God. And to show you what I mean here, and how there's this interplay between faith and reason, one thing I mentioned earlier is at the beginning of the Summa Theologica, Aquinas gives these 5 arguments for the existence of God. They're called his 5 ways. And if you look at each of his 5 ways, they end in a similar sort of way. So this paragraph here is just his second way, but it's an argument for the existence of God. But I just want to show you the last sentence. So he goes through this whole argument for why God exists. Then at the end, Aquinas says, therefore, one must posit some first efficient cause, which everyone calls God. Okay, so what is he doing here? Well, this is a perfect example of sort of the relationship between faith and reason. What Aquinas has given here is an argument. It's a set of reasons for why there must be this thing which he calls a first cause. But then, of course, the question is, well, how do we know this cause is God? And to a certain extent, I think Aquinas would say, well, if we continue to think about what this first cause must be like, there are probably some good reasons to think it's somewhat godlike. But I think Aquinas would also recognize reason can't take us all the way there to showing us that this first cause actually is God. So what do we need to complete the process? We need faith. So human reason can take us so far. It can show us there's a first efficient cause. It can show us, for instance, there must be an explanation of a contingent universe, or an explanation for why the universe is an ordered whole, right? Reason can take us that far. But we need faith, a gift from God, to bring us all the way into believing that the basis of perfect beatitude is possible. So that's the first theological virtue, this gift of faith which completes our human reason. Now, what about the second theological virtue, hope? So, suppose you have faith, right? Your faith and reason are interplaying in such a way that you now have a belief in God. What else do you need? Well, you not only need to believe that God exists, you also need to believe that a union with God is in fact possible. And so Aquinas explains this in the following way. He says, now the act of hope, in the sense in which we are now speaking of hope, attains to God. Insofar as we hope for something that is possible for us through God's help, our hope attains to God himself. So it is clear that hope is a virtue, since it makes a man's act good and makes it attain to the appropriate rule. So hope is this idea, it's an optimism, it's a sort of desire, it's a positive outlook that not only does God exist, but union with God is actually possible. And I think it can sometimes be easy to criticize such a point of view, because you might say, well, is hope just sort of like a wishful thinking? Is it just, creating this overly positive, naively optimistic outlook that it's possible for us to unite with God? And Aquinas wants to emphasize that no, that's not actually the case. Now, if we had no reasons to believe that God exists, for instance, if reason couldn't get us anywhere, if we didn't have the gift of faith, then maybe hope would be sort of a naive optimism. But he thinks if we do have good reason to think that God exists, if we have good reason to think that based on what we know about God, the reason and faith, that God cares about human beings, then it wouldn't be unreasonable to have hope or an optimism that a union with God is possible. And you might wonder, well, why does this need to be a gift from God then? Well, if we look out into sort of our everyday normal human life, it might be easy to be pessimistic. You might see human suffering, you might see acts of malevolence, you might see all sorts of things of that nature and just think, well, how could I possibly be optimistic in this view? How could I have hope that a perfect beatitude would truly be possible? So given that this is the case, I think what Aquinas wants to say is that this hope that we need to push us forward, to make us strive for perfect beatitude, again, is not something we can attain by our own effort alone. It must be given to us from the outside. It must be infused by God himself. And then this leads to the final of the three theological virtues, which, as you'll recall, based on the passage from Scripture that Aquinas cited, is the most important. And that's charity or love, or even a certain sort of friendship. Now, what's really interesting here is that what Aquinas does first, he considers some objection to the idea that a sort of love or charity between human beings and God is possible. And let's consider some of these objections. So one, what charity is this virtue we have in virtue of which we love God and also love all of humanity. So given that, there might be two different objections you could level. One, you might say, well, how can human beings love God? God and human beings do not share a life, right? I mean, God exists outside of space and time. God is not a human being. The relationship between God and human beings is radically unequal. God is perfect. We're very imperfect. So it might be said, well, how can we possibly sort of share a life with God? That's one objection. A second objection gets directly to some of the things we saw with Aristotle's theory of friendship. So you'll remember that for Aristotle, all friendship or love is based on the idea that either the other person you love or are friends with is useful, pleasant, or virtuous. But then what if, the question is, what if there's someone out there who's not pleasant, not virtuous, and also not useful, like a totally corrupt, annoying person to be around? How is love with them possible? It seems like in Aristotle's view, it wouldn't. Friendship or love toward them would not be possible. Yet, of course, if Aquinas is right about charity, and if we are supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves, as it is said in Matthew, then it's not clear how that could be the case. You might say, well, not only is love toward God not possible because we're so different and unequal, but also how can I love all of humanity? How can I love my enemies when they are morally corrupt, they're not useful, they're not pleasant, and they're not virtuous? And another way he puts the objection is, well, charity is impossible because I can't possibly love those who are sinful. And you'll recall this goes directly back to Aristotle, and Aquinas is even citing Aristotle here, because for Aristotle, the foundation of true friendship was virtue. But if the foundation of true friendship is virtue, how am I supposed to love those who are sinners? Okay, so that's the problem, at least, that Aquinas faces, and so what he has to explain is how this universal charity, a love of God and a love of all human beings, whether they're the paragons of virtue or they're corrupt sinners, how a love of all human beings is possible. Now, the first thing he says is that, well, the reason we can have this sort of love or charity toward God is that God calls us toward beatitude. So, if you skip down a little bit here, he says, now this sort of mutual benevolence is founded upon something shared in common. So the mutual benevolence that characterizes love or charity is always found on something common. So the question is, what do God and human beings have in common? Therefore, since man shares something in common with God, insofar as God communicates his own beatitude to us, it must be the case that some sort of friendship is founded upon this sharing. So although human beings and God are radically different, Aquinas says, well, we do share something with God because God calls us to Him. God has even constructed us as beings that are constantly seeking Him, even if we are confused and we're pursuing the wrong things. The very fact that we're willing and striving and always seeking satisfaction is a sign that we are seeking the ultimate fulfillment that is God. And so because there is this call, because we are constantly implicitly seeking God, Aquinas thinks that there is in fact some basis of commonality between which human beings and God can exist in a relationship of charity. So let's suppose we accept that. Suppose we accept the idea that we can in fact love God and exist in this relationship of mutual benefit, benevolence between God and human beings. What about the rest of humanity? How do I still get around the problem that the rest of humanity contains many people who are my enemies or sinners? How can I love them? How can I be friends with them? And here's Aquinas' explanation of this point. In a second way, charity, is extended to someone with respect to another person. For instance, if someone has a friendship with a man, then by reason of that friendship, he loves all those who belong to that man, whether his children or his servants or those who are related to him in any way whatsoever. And the love for a friend can be such that because of one's friend, those who belong to him are loved even if they offend us or hate us. And it is in this way that the love of charity extends even to our enemies. So what's the point here? Can we directly, I think he agrees with Aristotle to some extent. Can I sort of directly love my enemy? Can I directly love those who are sinful and morally corrupt? Well, directly, no. Notice the way he phrases this here. He draws this analogy between loving someone's children because you love the parent and loving all of humanity because you love God. So imagine your best friend has some children, and then you ask yourself the question, could I love my best friend but hate my best friend's children? Well, in one way of looking at it, you might say no. Because if one thing to recall here is he characterizes the love that constitutes charity and friendship as willing the good of the other. So you say that you love your best friend. That means you will what is best for them. You will what is good for them. How could you love your best friend and will what is good for them if you didn't do the same thing for their children? For a parent, the well-being of their child is inextricably tied up with their own personal well-being. And if that's the case, you can't possibly, the idea would go, you can't possibly love the parent if you don't love the child. And so Aquinas applies the same reasoning to our relationship to other human beings, even if they're our enemies, even if they are sinners. The idea is that if you are to love God, you must love all of God's children. You must love all of humanity. And so actually we can't directly love all of humanity, but through the intermediary of God, through our love of God, we can recognize that we need to extend that same love, that same affection, that same charity to all human beings. And this is the way in which Aquinas seeks to make good on the idea that we need to love our enemies. And insofar as Aristotle didn't have anything like this intermediary of the divine being who has care and compassion for all human beings, it's going to be a fundamental difference between their two views of friendship or love, that for Aristotle we need to see something directly in the other person that engages us in order to exist in a relationship of love, benevolence, or charity with them. For Aquinas, on the other hand, the intermediary of God, our love for God, is what allows us to have a certain sort of love or affection for all human beings. To conclude this video, I want to say a few things about the idea that charity is the most important of the virtues. Because Aquinas poses this question, he says, what's the order of the theological virtues? And he says, well, that depends whether we're talking about the order of generation or order of perfection. So the order of generation would just mean, what are the order in which they come about? Like the order in time. Like what are the steps in which you would place these? And he says in the order of generation, first we have first we have faith, then we have hope, and finally we have charity. Now, why is that the case? Well, we can think about it this way. If I'm going to hope that union with God is possible, then it must be the case that I believe in God or think that God exists. So first I've got to have faith, and that is what allows me to have hope. And secondly, if I'm going to have love for God, right, I need to think it's possible. I need to have some hope that it's possible to have a union with that being or some sort of relationship with that being. So that's why in order to have charity, I first need to have hope. So in a human being's sort of journey or their pursuit of God, first comes the act of faith or the gift of faith, then we get the gift of hope, and then finally we get the gift of charity or this universal love. But there's also the other question, which really gets to our concern. What about the order of perfection? In the order of perfection, what is the most important of these? He's already told us that charity is the most important of the theological virtues. Why is that? Well, let's look at his explanation. Why is charity more important? Why is it sort of the capstone of both faith and hope? By contrast, in the order of perfection, Aquinas tells us, charity precedes faith and hope, because both faith and hope are informed by charity and acquire the perfection of virtue through charity. Charity is the mother and root of all virtues in the sense that it is the form of the virtues. And you might say, well, what does this mean? Why is charity the form of all the other virtues? And I think the fundamental reason is charity just does sort of encapsulate what perfect beatitude is all about, this final union and love of God. And if you think about all the other virtues, even the cardinal ones, but the theological ones as well, why is it important to have faith in God? So we can eventually come to love God. Why is it important to have hope that a union with God is possible? So we can eventually come to love God. Why do we inculcate all the cardinal virtues? So we can eventually start to have them in their purifying form, turn away from worldly affairs, and prepare ourselves to unite and finally love God. So while all the virtues are important and all play their role, ultimately what beatitude is this final union, mutual benevolence, and mutual love between God and man. And because that is our final end, that's our ultimate good, that's our ultimate satisfaction, charity is ultimately the most important of the virtues and takes priority in the order of perfection. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.